Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be joining you today, regardless of where you are, anywhere around the world. And my name is John Pickering, and I'm from Everton. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about behaviour science and water pollution in the context of one of the natural wonders of the world, the Great Barrier Reef. But before I do, I just wanted to reiterate a message that I think is central to the be.hive conference, but also the approach that Everton takes. And that is when we're talking about environmental challenges, and in particular, in this instance, water quality and water pollution, these are fundamentally people challenges or people problems. And therefore, the extent to which we can understand and work with people to modify or bring about behavioural change is necessarily important as part of solving those environmental challenges. And behavioural science is the underpinning, which gives us the tools and the strategies and the techniques to basically work out how to do that. How do you work with people to bring about change? And so this is where I want to talk today about our experience in applying behavioural science, as I mentioned, the context of water quality and the Great Barrier Reef, as part of Everton's Cane Changer program. And many of you will be familiar with the Great Barrier Reef, and unfortunately, probably also familiar with the fact that it's under quite a significant amount of threat from a number of environmental challenges. And one of those challenges, and quite a prominent one, is water quality, especially that running off from agricultural land adjacent to the Great Barrier Reef. And in particular, there is tremendous pressure that is being exerted upon the sugarcane farmers of the north of Queensland to adopt what's known as best management practices that help improve water quality, essentially. The program itself, and I'll just touch on this briefly because I think it is important. It's known as the Cane BMP or Best Management Practice Program, and it requires farmers to work through 3 core modules, which basically look at a number of different farming practices, things like nutrient management, pest and weed control, tillage practices, and so forth. All things that are predictive of water quality outcomes, of course, but also lots of different behaviours, if you will, lots of different practices and different conditions or circumstances which are necessary to consider in how and why you might adopt such practices. And what's really interesting is that the practices themselves, yes, we know they improve water quality, but they also tend to help the farmer in terms of their own productivity and profitability. In other words, it's a win-win. And what's even more interesting, though, is that a few years ago, after the program had been implemented, the rate of adoption, despite many different levers being pulled to try and increase that adoption, such as legislation, there were incentive schemes that were available, there was education and awareness campaigns, there was incredible pressure from governments and from the public. But despite all of those things, the adoption actually remained relatively low compared to what the government and others wanted to see in order to see those shifts in water quality to help protect the reef. And so as behavioural scientists, we were given the task of addressing one pretty straightforward question, at least in theory, and that is, why won't the cane farmers change? And that is, why won't they adopt this best management practice program? And this is where the power of behaviour science was realised. And I say that because what had historically happened was that there were assumptions made about why farmers may or may not wish to be part of this program. The behavioural science approach, on the other hand, provided this methodical approach to basically understanding what's happening in the context of farmers, what's informing their decision-making, their behaviour, and what levers, therefore, are available to us that we can look at to help drive behavioural change. And so a question that's worth asking is, well that's great in theory, but how do you go about that? And there are many different models for doing this, and perhaps we don't have the opportunity to expand on all of them today, but to give some insight into how Everton went about it in Cane Changer is, among other things, we drew on Kurt Lewin's field theory, which has many components, but one of the most important aspects of that is the notion of driving and restraining forces. And to change behaviour, Lewin contended, we're better off thinking about how do we understand and reduce those restraining forces rather than simply focusing on and trying to dial up, if you will, the driving forces. And so as a backdrop to the project, we applied that driving and restraining force lens. And very interestingly, we noticed a restraining force straight away in the form of learned helplessness. And what's really interesting is that many of you will be familiar with learned helplessness and the well-known early experiments by psychologists and others whereby they'd bring dogs into situations like what's depicted on the screen now with these pretty shocking apparatus, actually. And of course, the idea is that the dog couldn't escape by virtue of the setup of the apparatus, and then they would shock it, like electrocute the dog. It's a nervous, awkward laugh, that one I can assure you. And then, of course, they'd keep doing that until eventually they'd enable the dog the opportunity to escape. And when presented with the threat of the shock, what would the dog do? Nothing. He would lie there and submit to the electric shock. And therefore, in other words, it essentially learned to give up, is the whole point of learned helplessness. And you might ask, well, how does this relate to cane farmers? Well, when we did our analysis, driving restraining force analysis, we noticed straight away that the cane farmers have this enormous sense of pride over the reef. They see themselves as environmental stewards. And most importantly, that they had a long history of participation in all sorts of kind of environmental programs and best management practices and so on and so forth. And despite years, decades in some cases, of participation, they were still being blamed for the reef and held accountable for it and vilified. Public enemy number one. And so when a new program such as the one we're discussing today came along, they'd essentially learned to give up. Why bother was the point that was raised. And beyond learned helplessness, many farmers felt that by participating in a government-sponsored best management practice program, they were basically admitting that they were wrong, or they were in the wrong, and they had to somehow make up for their ill doing, which of course was another restraining force. And then for other farmers, the desirability and in some instances the capability to keep written records was very low. And there was limited trust and cooperation within the industry itself, particularly how it would band together to help resolve some of these big environmental challenges that it's implicated in. So there's just some examples of when we looked at the behavioral science way of thinking about driving and restraining forces in particular, some of the insights we could glean. And in fact, there were many more. But what I'll do is just now indicate, well, with that information and those behavioral insights, if you will, in mind, what were the levers that we could therefore pull to try and drive behavioral change? And the first one that I wanted to mention is this idea of positive social identity and really tapping into that idea of a positive social identity and what many people would even refer to as something like pride, as I mentioned a moment ago. And that we know that the farmers love the reef. We know that the farmers generally see themselves as doing the right thing or having done the right thing. And therefore we had to reframe the narrative about participating in this program. And we did so in this idea of setting the record straight. And that is, it was deliberately designed to overcome that learned helplessness of why bother participating. And also deal with the issue of, well, if I do participate, this is going to show that I was doing the wrong thing. So we had two key psychological restraining forces to deal with there. And setting the record straight was the narrative that we used to tap into that idea of a positive social identity. The second lever is behavioural skills training for wives of farmers. And the reason for that, about 99.9% of the cane farmers of Australia are male and they're married to women. And the wives tend to be more adept at keeping written records for a variety of reasons. An insight not previously really tuned into. So we developed a whole behavioural skills training program. You can see that depicted in the image, where we essentially worked with the wives to build the capability to keep the written records of fertiliser application, which is a mandatory requirement to complete the BMP program. And the third and final lever is this idea of building trust and cooperation. And what you see pictured on the screen here are representatives from the sugar mill group and also cane farmers themselves with behavioural contracts in their hands, proudly displaying them, signifying their commitment to work together in a cooperative and trusting manner towards things like the accelerated adoption of best management practices rather than have infighting as a group. And they were just three of multiple levers that we drew upon to activate a significant acceleration, as you will see from this graph here, of the adoption of BMP. And the game changer region is that one at the top, where you can see compared to the other regions where by and large the circumstances and context is the same, saw a significant acceleration in the voluntary adoption of BMP, thanks to the behavioural science approach, among other tools and strategies as well, of course. But nevertheless, the behavioural science approach was critical. So I'll leave it there, and just wanted to highlight again the relevance and importance of behavioural science in this context of water quality, water pollution, and in this case, the Great Barrier Reef, and wish everybody well in your endeavours to bring projects like this together. And it's been a great pleasure being able to spend about 10 minutes with you here this morning or this afternoon, and I look forward to meeting you hopefully in person soon. Thank you.